My name is April, and I'm 28 years old. Right now, I'm standing in a $15,000 wedding dress in front of 300 guests at the Plaza Hotel, and my fiancé Marcus just grabbed the microphone to announce he can't marry me. The words, "I can't marry someone I don't respect," are still echoing through the ballroom. But as I look into his eyes, I see something that changes everything. This isn't heartbreak in his face, it's triumph. Before I tell you how I turned his power play into his worst nightmare, let me know where you're watching from today. And if you've ever faced public humiliation, hit that subscribe button because this story will show you exactly how to reclaim your power when someone tries to destroy you in front of everyone. 5 years ago, I was just a legal assistant from small-town Ohio, fresh out of college and trying to make it in Manhattan. The law firm of Steinberg Coleman and Associates was everything I dreamed about. Glass offices overlooking Central Park marble floors that clicked under my heels, and partners who handled billion-dollar deals before their morning coffee got cold. Marcus Wellington III was everything you'd expect from that name. 32 years old, junior partner, Harvard Law graduate, and wearing suits that cost more than my monthly rent. The first time I saw him, he was destroying opposing counsel in a deposition, and I remember thinking he looked like a shark who'd learned how to smile. Our first real conversation happened over spilled coffee. I was rushing to deliver documents to the senior partners meeting when I literally ran into him outside the conference room. The papers went flying, my coffee-painted abstract art on his Italian shoes, and I wanted to disappear into the marble floor. But he laughed. Not at me, but this warm, genuine sound that made me look up from where I was frantically gathering papers. He helped me collect everything, told the senior partners the delay was his fault, and later that afternoon, a new coffee appeared on my desk with a note saying, "For the one that got away." The courtship was like something from a movie. Broadway shows where he somehow always had the best seats. Weekend trips to the Hamptons in his family's cottage that had 8 bedrooms. Dinner reservations at restaurants where they didn't list prices on the menu because if you had to ask, you shouldn't be there. My parents flew in from Ohio 6 months into our relationship. Dad owns a hardware store, and Mom teaches 3rd grade. They stayed at a Holiday Inn in Queens because Manhattan hotels were highway robbery. Marcus insisted on picking them up in his Tesla, took us to Le Bernardin, and ordered wine that cost $400 a bottle without blinking. Mom pulled me aside in the bathroom that night. She held my hands, looked me straight in the eye, and asked if I was happy. I told her I was living a fairy tale. She squeezed my fingers and said fairy tales were written by people who'd never had to pay rent. But I was 23 and in love with the idea of being chosen by someone like Marcus. When he suggested I should wear different clothes to firm events, I went shopping. When he mentioned my Midwest accent slipped out, sometimes I started watching pronunciation videos. When he said my friend Jessica from college was a bit much for his social circle, I started declining her invitations. The proposal happened exactly 18 months after we met, orchestrated like one of his legal strategies. He took me to Tiffany's on 5th Avenue on a Saturday morning, had them close the whole 2nd floor for us, and got down on one knee with a 3-carat cushion-cut diamond that caught the light like captured stars. The ring was on my finger for exactly 12 seconds before he was posting photos on Instagram. By the time we got to his apartment, we had 4,000 likes and hundreds of comments about what a perfect couple we made. His mother Margaret called within an hour. Not to congratulate us, but to inform me that Wellington Weddings had certain expectations. She emailed me a list of approved venues photographers who were suitable for our circle, and a subtle suggestion that I might want to consider Kleinfeld for the dress, since they would know how to work with different body types. The wedding planning consumed the next 18 months of my life, like a full-time job I never applied for. Marcus had opinions about everything. The flowers couldn't be carnations because they were suburban. The band needed to play jazz because contemporary music was pedestrian. The menu required a wine pairing for each course because anything less would be embarrassing. I suggested having the ceremony in my hometown church where my parents got married. Marcus laughed for 3 solid minutes before realizing I was serious. Then his face shifted to that expression he used with difficult clients, patient but pitying, like he was explaining basic math to someone who couldn't count. We would marry at the plaza, he decided. 300 guests, though I could only name about 40 people I wanted there. The rest were his law school friends, business associates, and what Margaret called essential social connections. My cousin Annie, who worked at Target, didn't make the cut. Marcus explained she wouldn't feel comfortable among his crowd anyway. The dress shopping should have been my moment. Every bride dreams about finding the one crying happy tears while your mom takes photos. Instead, Marcus insisted on coming along because he had invested considerable resources in this event and wanted input on the aesthetic. I fell in love with a simple A-line dress with delicate lace sleeves. It made me feel like myself, only elevated. Marcus stood behind me in the mirror, running his fingers along the fabric with the same analytical expression he used reviewing contracts. Too plain, he declared. We needed something that would photograph well for the Times announcement. He selected a ball gown with hand-sewn crystals and a cathedral train that required 2 people to arrange properly. The price tag made my mother gasp. $15,000 for something I'd wear once. Marcus handed over his black card without looking at the number. On the drive home, he mentioned casually that I should start that juice cleanse his trainer recommended. The dress was ordered 2 sizes smaller than my current measurements because it would provide motivation. My friend Jessica tried to intervene during my bachelorette party. While the other bridesmaids were drinking champagne at the spa Marcus had selected, she pulled me into the bathroom and locked the door. She held my shoulders and told me to really look at myself. The spray tan I'd never wanted. The hair extensions that gave me headaches. The way I now said, "we think," instead of "I think," when expressing any opinion. I told her she didn't understand Marcus's world, that certain standards were expected. She said the only standard that mattered was being treated with respect. We didn't speak for the rest of the party, and when Marcus heard about our conversation, he suggested Jessica might be jealous of our happiness. The incident started accumulating like evidence in a case file. The birthday dinner where he told his partners I was learning to appreciate proper cuisine when I couldn't identify the fish course. The charity gala where he introduced me as his project, and everyone laughed like it was charming. The Thanksgiving where Margaret spent 20 minutes explaining how Marcus usually dated women with advanced degrees, but he'd always been attracted to potential. My family drove up from Ohio for the rehearsal dinner. Dad wore his one good suit that he'd had since my high school graduation. Mom bought a dress from Macy's that she'd spent 3 weeks searching for. My sister Emma, fresh out of nursing school, had worked extra shifts to afford a new outfit. Marcus's family arrived like visiting royalty. Margaret's dress probably cost more than my parents' mortgage payment. His father, Marcus Sr., barely acknowledged my family's existence, except to ask my dad if he'd considered franchising his little hardware shop. The prenuptial agreement appeared 2 weeks before the wedding, like a diagnosis you'd been dreading. Marcus presented it casually over dinner at his apartment, sliding the papers across the marble countertop between our sushi order. Standard protection, he called it. Nothing personal, just practical. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. If we divorced, I would receive $10,000 for each year of marriage, capped at $50,000. No claim to his trust fund investment portfolio or future earnings. If I initiated the divorce, I got nothing. But buried on page 17 was something that would later save me. If Marcus publicly humiliated me or ended the engagement in a way designed to cause emotional distress, all terms became void, and I could pursue damages. His lawyer probably never imagined Marcus would be stupid enough to trigger that clause. I signed it anyway. By then I'd lost 15 pounds on his recommended diet, alienated most of my friends, and convinced myself that love meant changing yourself to fit someone else's vision. My signature looked shaky on the page, like even my hand knew this was wrong. The night before the wedding, Marcus's bachelor party ran late. He came to my hotel room at 2 a.m, drunk on $1,000 scotch and his own importance. He sat on the edge of my bed, running his fingers through my expensively highlighted hair, and told me I should be grateful. Not everyone gets chosen for this life, he said. Not everyone gets elevated from their circumstances. I was lucky he saw potential in me. Lucky his mother had accepted someone from my background, lucky to be joining the Wellington legacy. I lay there in the dark after he left, staring at the ceiling of the Plaza Hotel, and wondered if this was what drowning felt like. Slow and gradual until you couldn't remember what breathing freely felt like. The morning of my wedding arrived with perfect New York weather, like even nature had been paid to cooperate with Marcus's plans. The bridal suite at the Plaza was bigger than my childhood home, filled with white roses that cost $800 per arrangement. My mother sat in the corner looking small in the enormous space. She'd been up since 4, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee. Dad had gone for a walk because he couldn't stand being inside what he called a museum. Emma was trying to lighten the mood, making jokes about how at least the divorce would be profitable given the lifestyle I was entering. The hairstylist Marcus had selected pulled my hair so tight I felt my eyes water. The makeup artist transformed my face into something magazine-worthy but unrecognizable. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger wearing my body dressed up like a doll for someone else's pleasure. Jessica arrived with the other bridesmaids, all wearing the blush pink dresses Marcus had chosen because they photographed well. She took one look at me and I saw her bite her tongue. Instead, she busied herself with the champagne, making sure everyone had full glasses except me because Marcus didn't want me bloated for photos. That's when Jessica noticed the phone. Marcus had left his personal iPhone in the suite when he'd visited the night before, probably too drunk to notice. It kept lighting up with messages, the screen visible from where Jessica was standing. She glanced at me, then at the phone, then back at me. I knew that look. It was the same expression she'd had in college when she discovered my boyfriend was cheating. But this was my wedding day, and sometimes ignorance is easier than truth. The messages kept coming. Jessica finally walked over and turned the phone face down, but not before I saw a name. Brittany. The new paralegal from his office, the one with the Columbia degree, and the trust fund, the one Margaret had mentioned, would have been such a suitable match at 3 separate dinners. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. By 3:30, 300 guests had assembled in the grand ballroom. The string quartet Marcus had insisted upon played classical pieces I didn't recognize. White orchids lined the aisle, each arrangement worth more than most people's rent. My side of the ballroom looked like a small town had been accidentally invited to a royal wedding. 40 people who'd driven through the night or taken buses because flights were too expensive. My aunt wore the same dress she'd worn to every fancy event for the past decade. My dad's best friend from high school sat uncomfortably in a rented tux. Marcus's side glittered with the kind of people who treated weddings like networking events. I recognized partners from rival firms, judges who golf with his father, clients worth millions in billable hours. Margaret sat in the front row wearing a cream dress that bordered on white, a power move that didn't go unnoticed. The music changed to the processional. My bridesmaids began their walk, each step choreographed during yesterday's rehearsal. Jessica went last, turning to give me one final look that said everything. Run. Scream. Do anything but walk down that aisle. But I was already moving my father's arm linked through mine. He whispered that I looked beautiful, that he was proud that it wasn't too late to leave if I wanted. I squeezed his arm and kept walking because 300 people were watching, and the photographer was capturing every moment for posterity. Marcus waited at the altar, looking like a catalog image of the perfect groom. His tux was custom Armani. His smile practiced his posture, suggesting he was doing everyone a favor by being there. The officiant, a judge friend of his father's, began the ceremony with words about commitment and partnership that felt hollow in my mouth. We reached the part everyone jokes about, but nobody expects to matter. The judge asked if anyone objected to this union: speak now, or forever hold your peace. The dramatic pause that follows is usually filled with nervous laughter or shuffling feet. Instead, Marcus raised his hand. The ballroom went silent in a way that felt physical, like all the air had been sucked out. The judge looked confused, glancing between us, as if this might be some rehearsed joke. I stood frozen, my bouquet trembling in my hands, wondering if I'd imagined it. Marcus took the microphone from the judge with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment. He turned to face the crowd, his expression serious, but with something underneath it like a child about to show off a magic trick. He needed to address something important, he said. The crowd leaned forward collectively. Margaret's face showed no surprise, and in that moment, I knew she was part of this. He spoke about standards and compatibility, about the importance of marrying within your sphere. He listed my failures like a prosecutor presenting evidence. How I didn't understand contemporary art despite his attempts to educate me. How I still said "you guys" instead of "everyone" in professional settings. How my family's background, while respectable in its own context, didn't align with the Wellington legacy. Each word was chosen for maximum impact, delivered with the same precision he used to destroy witnesses in court. He mentioned the time I'd used the wrong fork at his club, the charity event where I'd admitted not knowing what foie gras was, the partners' dinner where I'd suggested public defenders deserved respect. He concluded by saying he couldn't marry someone he didn't respect intellectually, socially, or culturally. He needed a partner who elevated him, not someone he had to constantly educate. He wished me well in finding someone more suitable to my station. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people sat frozen, unsure whether to leave applaud or call security. I stood at the altar in my $15,000 dress, feeling every eye on me, waiting to see if I'd cry, scream, or faint. But as I looked at Marcus's face, I finally saw him clearly. The satisfaction in his eyes, the slight smirk he was trying to suppress, the way he kept glancing at his mother for approval. This wasn't a crisis of conscience. This was a performance, and I was the prop. Standing there in front of 300 people, feeling the weight of their stares and the beginning of their whispers, I had a moment of absolute clarity. It was like those movie scenes where everything slows down, and suddenly you can see the whole picture instead of just the frame you're trapped in. I thought about the laptop Marcus had left open in the bridal suite 3 days ago when he'd come to discuss final seating arrangements. I'd only glanced at it while looking for the seating chart file, but I'd seen an email thread with his best friend James. The subject line had been "The Ultimate Power Move," and I'd been too well trained by then to read further. But now, in this moment of public humiliation, those words blazed in my memory like neon. My father had started to rise from his seat, his face red with the kind of anger I'd only seen once before when a supplier had tried to cheat him. I caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. Emma was halfway out of her chair too, looking ready to throw her bouquet like a weapon. I raised my hand slightly palm down, asking them to wait. The crowd was getting restless. Someone in the back had started recording on their phone, probably already imagining the viral video potential. Marcus stood there, basking in his moment, waiting for me to crumble to run to give him the reaction that would complete his performance. I took 3 slow breaths, the kind they teach you in yoga class, to center yourself. Then I walked to the microphone with the same measured pace I'd practiced walking down the aisle. My cathedral train dragged behind me like the weight of everything I was about to shed. When I took the microphone from Marcus, our fingers brushed. He actually winked at me, so certain of his victory that he couldn't resist one final gesture of dominance. I smiled back, and something in my expression made his confidence flicker for just a second. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear through the sound system. "Thank you for finally showing everyone exactly who you are." The room shifted, that subtle change in energy when an audience realizes they're about to witness something unexpected. Marcus's smirk started to fade, replaced by the beginning of uncertainty. I told them about the prenuptial agreement first, how I'd signed it without protest because I'd believed in us, in him, in the fairy tale he'd sold me. But I also mentioned the clause on page 17, the one about public humiliation and emotional distress, the one that made the entire agreement void if he did exactly what he'd just done. Margaret stood up, then, her cream dress rustling with indignation. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone, the one Jessica had wisely suggested I keep tucked in my bouquet, just in case, she'd said. I found the recording app and hit play. Marcus's voice filled the ballroom through the speakers. A conversation from last week recorded in New York, where single-party consent made it perfectly legal. He was talking to James, laughing about his plan. The wedding humiliation would go viral, he said. It would establish him as someone who wouldn't compromise his standards, not even at the altar. The firm would respect him for it. Clients would admire his courage. But the best part, he said in the recording, was that I'd be too destroyed to fight the prenup. I'd slink back to Ohio with nothing, and he'd have the perfect story about the girl who'd tried to rise above her station. The crowd was no longer silent. There were gasps, murmurs, and from Marcus's side of the room, the sound of phones buzzing with messages. Richard Steinberg, the senior partner at Marcus's firm, was already heading for the door with his phone pressed to his ear. Marcus tried to grab the microphone back, but I stepped away, my movement graceful despite the massive dress. He was saying something about context, about jokes taken too seriously, but nobody was listening to him anymore. I had more recordings. The one where he discussed with Margaret how to break me down gradually, so today would seem like a mercy. The one where he bragged to Brittany about how he'd upgraded from corn-fed to Ivy League, meaning her. The one where he'd practiced his speech adjusting the words for maximum humiliation. Brittany, who'd been sitting in the fifth row on Marcus's side, stood up abruptly. Her face had gone pale under her perfect makeup, realizing she'd been named in what was quickly becoming a legal and social disaster. She tried to leave quietly, but in a room where everyone was now recording, there was no such thing as quiet. But I saved the best for last. You see, Marcus had made one critical error in his perfect plan. He'd been so focused on humiliating me that he'd forgotten about discovery. And when you're planning to destroy someone who has access to your computer, your files, your life, you should probably make sure you don't have anything to hide. The financial irregularities were complicated but damning. Client funds used for personal expenses, hidden in a maze of transactions that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. But Jessica's boyfriend was a forensic accountant, and he'd been very interested in what I'd accidentally discovered. I announced that copies of everything had been sent to the New York State Bar Association an hour ago. Also to the FBI's white-collar crime division, because some of those client funds had crossed state lines. And to 3 major newspapers because the public deserved to know what kind of man was handling their legal affairs. Marcus's face had gone from red to white to a concerning shade of gray. He looked at his mother, who for once seemed to have no answer. Margaret Wellington, the woman who'd controlled every aspect of her son's life, who'd orchestrated his rise through society, stood there watching her creation crumble. But I wasn't quite finished. Margaret's charity, the one that threw elaborate galas to raise money for underprivileged youth, had some interesting accounting too. Marcus had helped hide it, moving money through the firm's accounts to wash it clean. 20% of donations went to youth programs. The rest funded Margaret's lifestyle, including this wedding. Security had arrived by then hotel staff, who'd been alerted by the catering manager about a potential situation. I'd arranged this in advance too, explaining that there might be a disturbance and asking them to be ready. They positioned themselves near Marcus, who was now shouting about lawsuits, defamation, and criminal harassment. I addressed the room one more time. The reception was paid for, I told them. The food was exquisite, the band was ready, and the bar was open. Everyone was welcome to stay and celebrate. Not a wedding, but something better. A liberation. Then I set the microphone down and started walking back up the aisle. My train swept behind me like a queen's cape, and as I passed each row, something extraordinary happened. People started clapping. First my side, my family and friends who'd watched Marcus diminish me for 2 years. Then surprisingly from his side too. A junior partner who'd been passed over for promotion. A client's wife who'd been condescended to at dinner parties. Even one of Margaret's society friends who'd apparently been waiting years to see her taken down. By the time I reached the doors, half the room was applauding. Marcus's voice had become shrill, threatening everyone with lawsuits. But nobody was listening. Richard Steinberg had returned and was having an intense conversation with 2 other senior partners. The word disbarment floated across the room. Jessica met me in the hallway with a garment bag. Inside was a simple cocktail dress, black and elegant, the kind of thing I would have chosen before Marcus started dressing me. We went to the bathroom, where she helped me out of the wedding dress, leaving it in a puddle of expensive fabric on the marble floor. The reception that followed was the party I should have planned all along. Without Marcus and his family's oppressive presence, the room felt lighter, like someone had opened all the windows. The string quartet had been replaced by the band, who'd cleverly started with Aretha Franklin's Respect and had everyone cheering by the first chorus. My family had taken over the head table, and for the first time all weekend they looked comfortable. Dad had removed his jacket and was laughing with his brother about something. Mom was dancing with Emma, both of them having kicked off their heels. My cousin Annie, the one who hadn't made the original guest list, had somehow appeared with a +1 and was teaching Marcus's former colleagues how to line dance. Richard Steinberg approached me during the salad course. He was a legend in New York legal circles, the kind of lawyer who'd argued before the Supreme Court and had judges calling him for advice. He sat down in what would have been Marcus's chair and poured himself a scotch from the bottle someone had liberated from the bar. He told me he'd suspected something was off with the firm's accounts but could never prove it. Marcus had been clever, but not as clever as he thought. The evidence I'd provided would trigger a full audit going back 5 years. Several cases would need to be reviewed and the firm's reputation would take a hit, but ultimately they'd survive. Marcus wouldn't. Then he offered me a job. Not as a legal assistant, but as a compliance officer. They needed someone with an eye for detail and the courage to speak up when something was wrong. The salary he mentioned was more than I'd ever dreamed of making, and it came with law school tuition assistance if I was interested. Jessica dragged me onto the dance floor before I could fully process the offer. We danced to songs Marcus would have called pedestrian, surrounded by a mix of small-town Ohio and New York elite, who'd found common ground in witnessing karma delivered in real time. Brittany approached me near the chocolate fountain. Her perfect composure cracked like expensive foundation. She apologized, sort of. She'd thought Marcus was going to leave me respectfully, she claimed. He'd promised her a partnership track position and said I'd be better off without him anyway. She hadn't known about the public humiliation plan. I could have destroyed her then. Posted the text messages where she'd called me farmer girl and suggested Marcus could do better. But looking at her 25 and already selling her soul for a corner office, I felt something closer to pity. I told her to find a new firm, start fresh, and maybe date someone who didn't treat women like accessories. She nodded and left quickly, her Jimmy Choos clicking on the marble like a retreat. My dad gave the speech Marcus's father should have given. He talked about watching his daughter grow up, about the dreams she'd had, and the person she'd become despite recent attempts to change her. He said he'd never been prouder than when he watched me stand up there and refuse to be broken. He raised his beer, the Budweiser he'd specifically requested from the horrified bartender, and toasted to truth, justice, and the strength to walk away from people who don't deserve you. The video started going viral before the cake was cut. 3 different angles of Marcus's speech, his smugness captured in high definition. Then my response, calm and devastating, with perfect audio of his recorded admissions. Legal Twitter exploded. Reddit had 17 different threads. Someone started a GoFundMe for my law school tuition that I would later redirect to actual underprivileged youth programs. Marcus called 47 times before I blocked his number. His lawyer called 12 times after that. Margaret sent a single text suggesting we could work this out privately, which my new lawyer recommended by Richard Steinberg, and working pro bono for the publicity screenshot immediately. As the evening wound down, couples slow dancing to the band's final sets, Jessica and I stood on the balcony overlooking Central Park. The city sparkled below us like a promise that life could begin again, even when someone had tried to end it in the most public way possible. She asked if I regretted any of it. Meeting Marcus, falling for his world, letting him change me piece by piece until I barely recognized myself. I thought about it, really considered the question while the Manhattan skyline blinked its million lights. No, I finally said. Because without him, I might have spent my whole life apologizing for where I came from. He taught me through his cruelty that the only person whose respect I needed was my own. He'd given me an education worth more than his Ivy League degree, even if the tuition had been paid in humiliation. The hotel manager appeared with a bottle of champagne, the kind with a year on it that meant something. A gift, he said, from the staff. They'd apparently taken bets on whether the wedding would happen, and the ones who'd bet against it wanted to share their winnings. We toasted with the housekeeping staff, the caterers, and the security guards, who'd stood ready to escort Marcus out if necessary. By midnight, the plaza had mostly emptied. My Ohio contingent was heading back to their hotels, giddy with stories they'd be telling for decades. The society crowd had dispersed to their various galas and after parties armed with gossip that would fuel the social season. Marcus's colleagues had gone to an emergency meeting that would probably last until dawn. But a core group remained. Jessica, my sister Emma, a handful of college friends who'd driven up despite not being invited to the original wedding, and surprisingly, a few of Marcus's former colleagues who'd decided I was far more interesting than they'd been led to believe. We ended up in a dive bar in the East Village, the kind of place Marcus would have called health code violation waiting to happen. I was still in my cocktail dress, my makeup smeared from dancing, my expensive hair extensions removed and tossed in a plaza bathroom. I looked like myself for the first time in 2 years. The bartender, hearing our story, declared drinks on the house for the bride who'd turned the tables. We toasted with cheap beer and shots of whiskey that burned in the best way. Emma led the group in a rousing rendition of Before He Cheats that had the whole bar joining in, even though Marcus hadn't technically cheated, just conspired to destroy me. As the sun came up over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no wedding photographer could capture, I sat in a 24-hour diner with Jessica eating pancakes with extra syrup and hash browns that were definitely not on Marcus's approved diet plan. She asked what I was going to do now. The wedding was supposed to be followed by a honeymoon in Bora Bora, 2 weeks at a resort that cost more per night than most people made in a month. After that, I was supposed to move into Marcus's apartment, dedicate myself to being a Wellington wife, and produce appropriately pedigreed children. Instead, I had a job offer from one of the city's most prestigious firms. I had a viral video that would probably follow me forever, but marked me as someone who couldn't be broken. I had evidence that would likely lead to criminal charges against both Marcus and his mother, and I had something I'd lost somewhere between that first Broadway show and the final wedding dress fitting: myself. 6 months later, I sat in my new office at Steinberg Coleman and Associates, the same firm where I'd met Marcus, but now occupying a position that put me on equal footing with the junior partners. The compliance officer role came with responsibilities I'd never imagined handling, but Richard Steinberg had been right about my eye for detail. Marcus had been disbarred 2 months after the wedding that wasn't. The criminal charges were still pending, but his lawyer, the best money could buy, had advised him to plead guilty to lesser charges to avoid prison time. He'd been banned from practicing law, ordered to pay massive restitution, and last I heard was living in his parents' pool house while trying to reinvent himself as a consultant. Margaret's charity had been shut down by the state attorney general. The investigation revealed years of fraud that would have continued indefinitely if not for what the press had dubbed the Plaza wedding reversal. She'd avoided jail time due to her age and cooperation with authorities, but her social standing was destroyed. The Wellington name, once synonymous with power and prestige, had become a cautionary tale about hubris. Brittany had taken my advice and moved to Chicago, where she was reportedly doing well at a firm that valued her actual skills over her connections. She'd sent me a thank you note, brief but genuine, acknowledging that my public revelation had freed her from a path that would have destroyed her too. The viral video had indeed followed me, but not in the way Marcus had intended. Instead of being the humiliated bride, I became something of a folk hero. Women reached out with their own stories of emotional manipulation of partners who'd tried to diminish them of escapes they'd managed or were still planning. I started a blog, nothing fancy, just a place to share resources and support. It grew to 50,000 subscribers in 3 months. I was in therapy now twice a week, with someone who specialized in narcissistic abuse recovery. Dr. Chen helped me understand how Marcus had systematically dismantled my sense of self, a process called coercive control that was so gradual I hadn't seen it happening. She also helped me recognize the red flags I'd ignored, or explained away patterns I needed to understand to never repeat them. The money from the prenup violation was substantial. Marcus had been so confident in his plan that he'd never imagined having to pay out the penalty clauses. The settlement combined with the criminal restitution was enough to pay off my parents' mortgage, set up college funds for Emma's future kids, and still have enough left over for law school without touching the firm's tuition assistance. I'd started dating again slowly and carefully. Daniel was a public defender, everything Marcus would have sneered at. He made $40,000 a year, drove a Honda Civic, and spent his weekends volunteering at legal aid clinics. He also looked at me like I hung. The moon encouraged my opinions, even when they differed from his, and had never once suggested I change anything about myself. Our first date was at a hole-in-the-wall Thai place where the servers knew his name, and the pad Thai was perfect. He'd heard about the wedding everyone in New York legal circles had, but he wanted to know about my hardware store childhood, my favorite books, my dreams that existed before and beyond Marcus Wellington. Jessica was my maid of honor again 2 years after the Plaza disaster, but this time for a very different wedding. 50 people in my hometown church, the one where my parents had married 35 years earlier. Dad walked me down the aisle in his good suit, the same one he'd worn to the Plaza, but now comfortable and proud. Mom cried happy tears that didn't cost $800 to properly photograph. Daniel's vows included a promise to never dim my light, to celebrate where I came from, and to remember that love meant helping someone become more themselves, not less. My vows promised to trust my instincts, to never apologize for taking up space, and to build a partnership where both voices mattered equally. The reception was in the church basement, decorated with flowers from my aunt's garden and catered by the local Italian restaurant. My cousin Annie made the cake, 3 tiers of chocolate and vanilla that tasted like happiness. The band was actually just someone's iPhone hooked up to speakers, but we danced until midnight to songs Marcus would have called pedestrian, but we called perfect. The wedding cost less than one of the Plaza flower arrangements, but it was real in every way that mattered. No one performed for anyone else. No one felt out of place. No one whispered about anyone's background or breeding. It was just love, simple and true, surrounded by people who'd known us since before we knew ourselves. That night, as Daniel and I drove to our honeymoon, a cabin in the Smoky Mountains that his uncle was letting us use, I thought about the journey from that Plaza altar to this moment. The humiliation Marcus had planned as my destruction had become my resurrection. He'd wanted to break me publicly to demonstrate his power, to show the world that I was beneath him. Instead, he'd freed me. His cruelty had burned away everything false, everything I'd built to please him, leaving only the truth of who I was. The farm girl from Ohio who'd made it in Manhattan, not by changing herself but by remembering herself. The woman who could stand in front of 300 people in the middle of her own humiliation and turn it into triumph. The blog had become a book published by a major house that saw the value in stories about survival. Standing at the Altar, a memoir of power. Humiliation and Unexpected Freedom hit the New York Times bestseller list the same week. Marcus's sentencing was finalized. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I donated half the advance to establishing a real charity for underprivileged youth pursuing legal careers, run by people who actually cared about the cause. The other half went into a scholarship fund at my hometown high school, specifically for students who might otherwise apologize for dreaming too big. During the book tour, I met hundreds of women and men who'd been in their own versions of my story. Partners who'd made them feel small families, who'd treated them like project systems that told them they needed to be fixed to be worthy. Each signing became a kind of group therapy, strangers finding strength in shared experience. The final stop of the tour was in New York at a bookstore 6 blocks from the Plaza. The irony of geography wasn't intentional but felt appropriate. The crowd was standing room only, filled with faces I recognized. Former colleagues from the law firm, some of Marcus's ex-girlfriends who'd reached out with their own horror stories, and surprisingly, a few of his family's former society friends who'd confided that they'd been waiting years to see the Wellingtons fall. During the question period, someone asked if I ever regretted not just walking away quietly when Marcus made his announcement. If I wondered what would have happened if I'd simply left with dignity intact and moved on with my life. I thought about it for a moment, really considered what that alternate timeline might have looked like. Me slinking back to Ohio in shame. Marcus triumphant in his cruelty. Margaret validated in her snobbery. The cycle's continuing with the next woman he chose to diminish. No, I said, because walking away quietly would have been accepting his version of the story. It would have been agreeing that I was less than unworthy someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect he'd thrown my way. By speaking up, by refusing to be broken, by turning his weapon against him, I'd changed the narrative not just for myself, but for anyone watching who'd been told they weren't enough. The power in that moment at the altar hadn't come from revenge or anger or even preparation. It had come from finally seeing clearly that his opinion of me had never been about me at all. It had been about his own insecurity, his need to feel superior, his fear that someone might discover he wasn't as special as he'd been told his whole life. Standing at that altar, I'd realized something that changed everything. He could only humiliate me if I agreed to be humiliated. He could only diminish me if I accepted his measurement of my worth. He could only break me if I believed I was something that could be broken, rather than someone who could choose to bend or stand tall. The book signing ended with a standing ovation that felt like the bookend to that Plaza applause. But this time I was standing as myself, wearing a dress I'd chosen, surrounded by people who valued truth over performance, substance over status. That wedding day, Marcus had thought he was taking my dignity in front of 300 people. He'd planned it, meticulously orchestrated every detail, prepared for my tears or rage or collapse. He'd imagined himself walking away victorious while I crumbled in designer silk and shame. Instead, he'd handed me my freedom on a silver platter. He'd shown everyone exactly who he was thinking it would reflect badly on me. But mirrors work both ways, and the image he'd projected had revealed more about him than he'd ever intended to share. In trying to break me publicly, he'd broken himself. His reputation, his career, his carefully constructed image, all shattered by his own hand. The powerful move he'd planned had become his undoing, and the woman he'd tried to humiliate had simply told the truth and let his own words condemn him. The book ends with a simple observation that I share with anyone who asks about that day. When someone shows you who they are in public, believe them. When they think they're demonstrating power by causing pain, they're actually revealing weakness. And when they try to break you in front of an audience, remember that you get to decide what breaking means. Marcus thought breaking meant shattering into pieces too small to reconstruct. But breaking can also mean breaking free, breaking through, breaking open to let light into places that have been kept dark. He'd meant to destroy me, but instead had broken the shell I'd built to fit into his world, revealing someone stronger than either of us had imagined. Sometimes I wonder if he ever understands what really happened that day. If he realizes that in his moment of imagined triumph, he'd actually liberated someone he'd spent 2 years trying to imprison. If he knows that his cruelty had been the key to my freedom, his humiliation the door to my happiness. But mostly, I don't think about him at all. Because the best response to someone who tried to make you small isn't to make them smaller. It's to grow so far beyond them that they become a footnote in your story, a brief chapter about learning to recognize your own worth, a reminder that nobody else gets to tell you who you are. And honestly, it was the best wedding gift I never asked for. Have you ever stood up to someone who tried to humiliate you publicly? What gave you the strength to fight back instead of running away? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with anyone who needs to remember their own worth, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to be broken by someone else's cruelty. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you are always stronger than someone else's opinion of you. May you find the courage to stand tall when others try to make you small, and may you always remember that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's inability to see it.